Macron is the symbol of those deep contradictions, that to use this word figuratively, he can only escape the political guillotine for some time. It may take 1 or 2 years, but I think that ultimately he will be forced out of office, or he will see the wisdom of leaving office. The contradictions are so deep that he cannot afford the luxury of just hanging in there, because sometimes hanging in there is not the solution. But he may also want to stay in power. And if he does, I think he's going to be confronted with situations that are not going to be very pretty. It's true that the world is going through a very tumultuous period. And what one sees is that the world is moving towards a multipolar world. It is no longer the European countries that are the hegemons. They are new players who are emerging. The Russians are emerging in terms of international relations, as are the Chinese in a subtle way. But because you pose a very direct question about France, let us begin with France. France must be understood in the context of her colonial and neo-colonial past and posturing. When France was present in Indochina, in Vietnam, and in those parts of the world, and of course present in Africa, primarily, France literally governed in a manner that was designed to disable her colonies. That is how you understand the emergence of the Fifth Republic in 1958 with Charles de Gaulle. And as regards the African states at that time, the referendum in 1958, which was designed to appear to grant independence to African countries, but to retain control, was in itself a clear indication that France did not want to let go the colonial project, and therefore initiated and continued to perpetuate a neo-colonial project. The only country, that, of course, that voted no at that time was Guinea under Ahmed Sékou Touré, which, as we know, was then punished very heavily. The Algerians were also very determined in the opposition to the French. So after the 1958 referendum, France literally controlled her colonies and extracted her minerals, controlled their banking, controlled their currency, and pretty much they were external territories. And of course, then after the World War II, which I prefer to call the European Tribal War, what then happened is that many of these colonizers, France included, started to lose their luster and to lose their grip. And that grip was lost even more because the United States became the new hegemon. So when you look at France today, you see a France which, courtesy of our colonial past, accommodated people from different parts of our colonies. You find very large Algerian communities, very large Senegalese communities, very large Cote d'Ivoirian communities. And these communities cannot be ignored because of the demographies, and they are threatening the French indigents. And that is why you've seen that since the emergence of the administration of Macron, there have been very major difficulties, and these difficulties must be understood at several levels. One, you have a France that has lost her access to minerals in her former colonies. Two, you have a France which is diplomatically weak. Three, you have a France which within the European context does not play the role that she thinks she should play as one of the key players. You have a France where the internal contradictions are threatening every administration. And in that context, you must see the emergence of the right wingers such as the Le Pen, both the father and the daughter. So all those contradictions are coming to bear. And because they are happening during the administration of President Macron, he is seen as the architect of the failure of France. And seen from that perspective, he himself is beginning to reassert himself. And what way to reassert yourself than to use the crises that have emerged since your administration? And there are several crises. Crisis number one, that you have had the emergence of changes of power which are extra-constitutional in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso. And what have they done? They have said, you are no longer going to take our uranium in the manner that you did. We are no longer going to have France or French as our only language. We are going to choose who to work with, and we are no longer going to be obedient servants within La Francophonie. We are no longer going to use CFA franc, which you control. Within Europe, the war between Ukraine and Russia has also created yet another crisis. It is a crisis that started on the basis of the Russians saying that in 1990, when the then Soviet Union collapsed, you assured Russia and indeed assured those in the East, particularly Russia, that there would be no 1-inch movement to their territory. What has happened since is that you have moved to Poland, you want to move into Georgia, you want to move into Ukraine, and the French are in the forefront. The French and the British, the major colonizers, are in the forefront. And they want to use this as an occasion to reassert themselves. And you hear the very bellicose language that emanates from Macron. You've heard him even in cases when he has had meetings with President Trump of the United States of America. When Trump proposes means and ways of ending the conflict, it is the French and the British, since Kim Steimer, who are in the front of saying, no, this must not happen in this way. So what started as a conflict between Russia and Ukraine has now become a proxy war in which every other breach is being articulated by Macron as an affront to NATO. And NATO is being invoked from where I sit, and I stand to be corrected, as this body that when you attack one, you attack all, in the belief that the United States of America would come to the aid of Europe if there was a war between Europe and Russia. But the reality is that that is not so very predictable, particularly if you listen to President Trump, who once said, almost jokingly, that there is a big, beautiful ocean between us and Europe, and that we are not going to be the ones that underwrite the cost of NATO. So all those factors conjoined are producing a France that is in a state of confusion, a France that is trying to reassert herself, a France that is trying to say we are the leaders of Europe, and a French leader who is facing rebellion from within and who in ordinary circumstances ought to have called a general meeting at which his own leadership is being challenged. But of course, we know that the Constitution of France is one that allows for what they call cohabitation, which allows the president to continue in office and only disturbs the prime minister and the political parties. So he is, if I'm allowed to use what would be a very European term, skating on very thin ice. But he must do so because the decks are laid against him, and he has no choice but to appear tough, even if he is trembling inwardly. I personally hold the view that the contradictions within France are so deeply rooted now, and that Macron is the symbol of those deep contradictions, that to use this word figuratively, he can only escape the political guillotine for some time. It may take 1 or 2 years, but I think that ultimately he will be forced out of office, or he will see the wisdom of leaving office. The contradictions are so deep that he cannot afford the luxury of just hanging in there, because sometimes hanging in there is not the solution. But he may also want to stay in power. And if he does, I think he's going to be confronted with situations that are not going to be very pretty. Remember that the economy of France is not as strong as it was several years ago. It no longer has resources to her former colonies. So there'll be a lot of grandstanding going forward. There'll be a lot of gunboat diplomacy. There'll be a lot of alibis. And I think the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is for the moment providing that. Remember the old saying that if you have a problem at home, you create an external enemy. Then you unify the home front. I think Macron is trying to use that. And immigration is one of the things that they are trying to use, that we are doing what we are doing, which is causing you anger and making you angry, because we want to have a France that is controlled from within, a France that is strong. But ironically, what that is doing, it is strengthening the hand of the far right, so that you see Marine Le Pen, if you look at the opinion polling, those who are of the French indigents are leaning towards her because of this scarecrow called the danger of the immigrants. So I think, as was said in the Bible, the days of Macron are numbered. Mene, mene, tekel, upersin, that your days are counted. I think it is found in the book of Daniel for those who are biblically inclined. His days are numbered like the pages of a book, and sooner rather than later, he will meet his political Waterloo. In my view, the architecture and the DNA of French politics will not change even if Macron were to leave. Remember that even this distinction that we talk about between the far right and the liberal, in real terms, these are two sides of the same coin. And is not unique to France. There is a sense in which you feel, and one sees this even when one travels through Charles de Gaulle Airport. One sees white French people have resentment for immigrants because they think that the resources are dwindling and they do not want people who are competing for these resources. So you may have the rhetoric of those who are saying we don't want immigrants, but the reality is that even those who are not saying so are hostile to immigrants. So nothing dramatically will change in terms of the political DNA of France. They will still want to reassert themselves, and this will happen because they feel threatened. Like all the slave masters, even when the slave has long gone, they have this appetite to want to enslave. And I think that is what is happening. And that is why La Francophonie is even looking for new clients. You can see the diplomatic engagements of France with countries that were not colonized by her. So in a nutshell, I don't think there'll be dramatic change. I don't think that the difference is that large in terms of this political orientation. I think all French politicians are moving towards the middle, their rhetoric notwithstanding. You know, I stand to be corrected, and I may even be wrong, and I don't even claim expertise in what I'm just about to say. But When I look at Europe now, particularly when you listen to the rhetoric of the British and the rhetoric of the French, you almost believe that they have an appetite for war, as if they believe that a war is necessary for Europe to reassert herself. And that is why progressively, through the rhetoric of countries such as France and the United Kingdom, one sees the Ukrainian-Russian conflict as a proxy war. Indeed, one can say that the Ukrainians are simply the tip of the arrow, and that really those who are egging them on are the European powers, particularly France and the United Kingdom. So when they say that they want to be present on the ground, that they want to be the guarantors of peace, if it ever comes between Ukraine and Russia, they are simply saying we want to assert ourselves, and they are forgetting history. And remember that even in times when Europe had some kind of dalliance with Russia, there was always suspicion. And those who were behind this suspicion were the French and the British. So one sees a situation where there is the supposition that if you are to create a conflict which is led by NATO, you would then bring in the United States of America. But because of the diplomatic ambivalence of the United States of America, they are not quite certain. And one may even ask, are the French ready to put boots on the ground in Ukraine? Are they ready to put boots on the ground in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia? Are they prepared to do so? Recently, you've seen the rhetoric when some drones were said to have strayed in Poland. You could see the vitriol or hear the vitriolic statements that were emanating from France and from the United Kingdom and beginning to beat the drums of war. And I believe that this kind of saber-rattling diplomacy may also be a tactic. Remember that the United States of America, through President Trump, have suggested that there be a truce, there be an armistice, which would also entail, among other things, the freezing of the possible membership of Ukraine into NATO and the European Union, and also the trading of territory. But the French and the Europeans are hostile to this, as if they are simply saying, we want to fight it out. But the question is Europe prepared for what would possibly be a nuclear war? Are they prepared? Are the countries that are being used as proxies and are supplying planes such as the Netherlands and the Denmark capable of withstanding a nuclear war, knowing as we do the number of nuclear warheads that Russia has in her possession, the number of drones in her possession? These are questions that must be out there. And those whose rhetoric is vitriolic, those who have an appetite of war, who think that a war is going to reset Europe and to make Europe reassert herself in the world, in my view, are deluding themselves. And the sooner they embrace peace, the sooner they stop egging Zelensky and the Ukrainian administration on and embrace peace, the safer they are. And I believe that in the new multipolar world, every country in Europe must now reset. They must also know that the demography in Europe is against European nations. These are very aging populations, and they may not even have the forces to fight. You know, whenever people agitate for war, they think that war has logic to it, that war is rational. When war has started, it acquires a life of its own. And when countries are threatened and survival becomes the only thing, there is no limit to what they will do. Of course, in the early days of any war today, you start with troops on the ground, you move to drones nowadays, you move to ballistic missiles. But when you begin to threaten my territory and I have in my possession nuclear weapons, what would stop me from using them? And one only has to remember what happened to Japan with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the Nagasaki-Hiroshima specter could be reproduced very easily. And it takes only one mistake, and then the world will be a totally different place. And it is incumbent upon these warmongers in Europe to be told that the world is safer when diplomacy is given its pride of place. You can see that because of the warmongering now in Europe, the institutions that were created after the 1945 war, the Second World War, have now been neutered. The United Nations can meet and give all manner of statements and all manner of sanctions, and nobody cares about these institutions. So that if one were to look at things from a perspective that is inclined towards creating new peace in the 21st century, it would entail drawing back and thinking of ways of reforming these institutions. And what does that require? It requires that the rhetoric from France, the rhetoric from Paris becomes conciliatory. The rhetoric from London becomes reconciliatory. The rhetoric from Brussels, which is the European Union headquarters, becomes conciliatory. The rhetoric from Berlin becomes conciliatory. It's instructive that Berlin has not been as caustic as London and Paris have been, which is indicative of their desire to play a more subtle role. And of course, the United States of America, as I've said before, is a little bit ambivalent, but they too don't want to participate in something that will spiral out of control. You know, when one talks about the state of the world and the possibility of war in the continent of Europe, one may ask today, if you are to conduct a poll in the streets of London or Manchester or in Marseille or in Paris or Lyon, or to do so in Copenhagen, in Stockholm or in Oslo or in Rome or in Brussels or in Ghent or in Berlin, and you would discover that the streets of Europe are not interested in war. But politicians prosecute and initiate wars in which they themselves will not fight. They want to be remembered as the heroes who defended something which they defined. But I think if you look at Europe now, they are incapable of articulating the single thing that would justify war. But history is also rich with countries that have been pulled into war because there was a straw man, if you may, that was created and then which becomes the target and justifies this subject of hatred. And I think the Europeans have tried to paint Russia and President Putin as this person that we must decimate, this person whose desire is to destroy Europe. And they are not succeeding, particularly in Western Europe. And you only have to listen to the commentators in Europe who are not biased and who are not vitriolic to know that the desire is to have peace and to negotiate peace between Ukraine and Russia. And I hope that this is what will carry the day at the end of all these verbal conflagration. But the reality is they know that a war that is prosecuted in this day and age, a war that is prosecuted where you are deploying ballistic missiles and deploying drones, is a war that can decimate, and a war that could degenerate into nuclear, a war that could degenerate into biological warfare, is not a war that you want to fight. And one hopes that the politicians will listen to the ground. Sometimes politicians think that they have taken the pulse of their nations and the pulse is wrong. And I think that that is what is happening, particularly in the case of France and also in the case of the United Kingdom. And occasionally you see when they rise up, even as relates to matters such as the conflict in Gaza, you can see that the people are saying, we don't want this kind of thing. And they are telling the people, we don't want you. And in fact, the very fact that President Macron in France particularly is receiving very bad opinion polls is a confirmation that the people don't want the style that he has adopted, the style of belligerence. The world is now like a pot that is being shaken in terms of alliance. If you look, for example, in terms of, and there's alliance at two levels. There is military alliance and there is economic alliance. The NATO formation remains an alliance that was created for the purpose of defending Western Europe. And on paper, it remains an alliance. But they are not reading from the same script at all times. You can see that with what America says every so often, even when they promise to help. There is also the emergence of other powers who are aligning and realigning at different levels. Look at Turkey, for example. Look at Iran. Look at China and Russia and North Korea and sometimes India and Brazil. And this tells you that these alliances are shifting. The ground is shifting. The parts are moving. But there is one thing, one single thread that I think is emerging from my view. The resentment of the possible reemergence of the colonial powers. France being one of them. The United Kingdom being one of them. Because the other colonial powers which were there, like Portugal, no longer threaten anybody. Spain no longer threatens anybody. Germany no longer threatens anybody. The United States of America has become much more transactional. What is in it for us? We want your minerals. Whether you are Ukraine, we give you this, you give us your minerals. You are the Democratic Republic of Congo, we give you this and you give our minerals. So it is only countries like France, which through their neo-colonial institutions such as La Francophonie, fear that they are losing territory. It is only the United Kingdom who through their neo-colonial institutions such as the Commonwealth feel that they may be losing something. But there are no settled alliances. Things are moving. And this movement, I believe, will redefine itself, will keep on defining and redefining itself, but it points to one direction, that the world is going to be multipolar. There is not going to be a single hegemon. Alliances are going to be alliances of a transactional nature, which are going to be dictated by trade rather than by military might. And you see this when you listen to what is being said at the meetings of the BRICS, when you see the meetings, what is being said at G20, when you see the rhetoric of the 77 and the Global South, one gets the feeling that things are not going to happen as others wish. And those others mean the former colonizers. I've been following the visit of President Trump. I think one can almost predict what is going to emerge in the communique. We are old allies. Our transatlantic trade must be strengthened. Our military alliances must not be undermined. We must not allow the Russians or any other emerging powers to disturb what is settled. We are not going to allow anybody to threaten world peace, and we must retain our historical ties. I think that is going to be the essence of the statements that are going to emerge. People are going to be polite and friendly, but that politeness and friendliness is momentary. When the Americans go back home, there are a lot of things to be dealt with in the North American region, in the Latin American region. And I think that is what is going to preoccupy the United States of America, because even our own economy is under threat by a dint of these very very, very ambivalent manner in which they have dealt with the question of immigration. So nobody is at ease. You'll see many visits of that kind. I believe that after a short while, there'll be a reciprocal state visit by Steinmeier to the United States, and the same rhetoric, and is like that, and is going to happen in the nature of what I call diplomatic ping-ponging. You know, I don't think that Trump has Africa as a major cog in the wheel of his diplomacy. Remember, this is his second term. Perhaps one day he is going to visit one of the African countries. I don't know whether that country is going to be Kenya, or is going to be South Africa, or is going to be Nigeria. But I believe that before his term ends, remember that his term will end sooner than you know it. And I believe that before his term ends, he may be persuaded to visit the continent of Africa, particularly as they now see, and this is something that you hear from the American diplomats, the presence of China, the presence of Russia, and the need for America to push back. Remember, there is a major project that is beginning to be undertaken, the Lobito Corridor, which is meant to rival the China Road and Belt program. So I wouldn't be surprised, never say never, but even if he comes, it will be for the optics. You know, the USA's diplomatic posturing is very difficult to understand at this time, because when the Trump administration came into power, the appetite was to make what I called microwave peace. Very quickly, within 24 hours, we are going to solve the problem between Russia and Ukraine. Within so many hours, we are going to solve the Gaza, the Palestinian problem. Now, the realities dawned on the U.S. Diplomat that it was not as easy. It was a lot more nuanced, and that there were no easy solutions. And one can therefore see an America that wants to remain positively neutral. And perhaps it is useful to unpack what one means positively neutral, that they want to remain as the single country that can resolve the problem, but whenever it suits them, they appear to be with the Europeans as not NATO allies, and whenever it suits them, they appear to say, but Russia must also be listened to. So it is true to say that one sees a United States of America under President Trump who would want to go down in history as the one who brokered the peace. A Trump that would want to be remembered by historians as one who was capable of doing what others could not do. But yet the ground is not lending itself to easy solutions. And that is why he is telling the Europeans, let's have something. Even if it involves that we are trading territory, even if it means that we are losing some things, let there be some peace, at least during the period that I'm the president. So I think that that is the position in which the United States has found herself. And for that reason, it is very possible that if there were to be a war in Europe, they would stay out of it in the early days and wait for the outcome. And once it becomes untenable, they would come in and say, this must stop. Rather speculative, but possible. I think President Trump has come into power at a very interesting time. He's come to power at a time when the world is not as easy to predict as it was several years ago. He's come into power at a time when the United States of America is not the economic hegemon that it once was. He's come to power at a time when the world is looking for a new spirit because of the emergence of new players such as China, India, Brazil, Russia, Turkey, and even the African Union is beginning to say that we can no longer play second fiddle. In that scenario, he has only had one instrument available to him, a disruptive instrument called tariffs. And you've seen him use a tariff as a weapon in the economic arena. The other weapon that he has used is immigration. And you've seen that in the immigration circle, he has tried to rope in everybody by telling a number of African countries there are certain undesirables. We want to take some to Eswatini. We want to take some to Uganda. We want to take some to Rwanda. And he has also been a disruptor in terms of engaging in very transaction relationship. We are going to help the Democratic Republic of Congo have peace, but we want your minerals. So he's a disruptor. He's a disruptor who defies narrow and strict definitions. And because of his disruptive nature and style of politics, the rest of the world is now beginning to rethink differently and to realize that the only way in which we can confront this particular power is by uniting and identifying the things that are in our best interest. That is why you see the BRICS cannot be ignored. That is why you see that African Union is now beginning to engage even with the Arab world, with the Qataris, with the Bahrainis, with the Omanis, and also engaging with the Russians, also engaging with the Japanese, engaging with the Chinese, engaging with the Turks to send a message that we have alternatives. So in a single word, I would say that President Trump will be remembered as the chief disruptor of politics, diplomacy, and economics in the world.